Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webcast, Inclusion Confusion. This webinar is sponsored by Limeade and has been pre-approved for 1 HRCI credit and 1 SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have questions during the webcast, questions or comments, please place those by clicking Q&A in your webinar controls and typing them in there. Once the presentation has begun, I will post a link to the slides and to an exit survey in the chat area. A new tab will open in your browser with the survey, so please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast has ended. All right, we have a great lineup of panelists here, folks. So happy to have the folks with Limeade here with us today. So I'd like to take this moment to pass it over to Ritu and Venus and Justin. Thanks so much.
Can everyone hear me okay? All good?
You're great there now.
Great. We're rolling with it. Technology is our lives now, so just getting used to all of this. Appreciate you all joining us today. My name is Ritu, and I'm joined today by Justin and Venus, and we're so excited to cover today's session. We've been planning for this and just lots of great content. Before that, I'll just introduce myself and let Justin and Venus introduce themselves. My name is Ritu, and I head up the research team at Limeade. So I really focus on answering the question of what does research have to do with all these topics? How does science inform what we know, how we pursue inclusion? What do we really need to focus on? What does it mean to begin with? And so we do both primary and secondary research on any and all topics within organizational psychology, really. So I'm really excited to cover some of that research today with you all. And Justin, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Justin Lehman with Great Heart Consulting. We're a Seattle-based inclusion consulting company. And my role is the director of the Inclusive Leadership Strategy. So it's working with partnering with our learning team, organizations to be able to roll out programs for people. One of the key things we talk a lot about is inclusion includes everybody. So we're glad that you are here in this conversation today and working on different strategies and ways that everybody is a part of the conversation, the solution moving forward. Venus?
Thank you, Justin. Good morning, everyone. And I lead Neural Shifts, which is a consultant firm in Seattle, Washington. And we focus on driving culture change using a D&I lens. Our passion as well is science. And so what we do is we translate scientific insights into management practices. And I believe that our session today will be all about translating science into what you do in your current organization. Thank you. Back to you, Rick.
Thank you. And so we are really, you heard it from both Justin and Venus, they bring some expertise around this. So we're all going to speak to those relative areas. I'll kick us off with covering the foundations of inclusion. What is it? What's the literature say about this topic in general? And then Venus will cover what is our individual role in it? Okay, understanding what it is, what do we do? How do we turn that into an action? How we understand inclusion as something that we can influence? And then Justin mentioned inclusion includes everyone. And so he'll end with some really interesting insights and research that they've done to really broaden this conversation out and say, regardless of who you are, and you need to understand your unique identity and know that that's valuable and that it's so important to this conversation. And then we'll end with some Q&A time. But before we jump into content, I wanted to start us off with a quick question. So you should see a poll emerge, and Rhonda, I'll let you kick that off. But we want everyone to think through just your own level of comfort with the topic of inclusion. Some answer options here: not at all, don't really see the point of it, a little bit, but primarily uncomfortable, learning a bit, certainly room to grow, starting to get it right most of the time, or you're pro and you're really starting to wonder why you joined this webinar. So it looks like we still have some votes coming in.
Yeah, let it run another 7 seconds, folks. All right, Ritu, I'll share the results with you here. There you are.
All righty, let's see. So we have majority of folks falling into learning a bit, room to grow, with 54% answering that. And then the next highest is getting it right most of the time with 38%. So we're seeing people starting to trend more towards learning, right? We are, as I just say, as a society, as everyone is starting to realize the importance of it. So that's awesome. We are moving in the right direction. So with that, let's jump back in here. Covering the foundation of what inclusion is, so we're all on the same page about how we are approaching this topic. Simply put, inclusion is a simultaneous sense of uniqueness. So I'm seen for my unique self, Ritu, and who I am, everything that makes me, me, and belonging. I feel like I'm a part of this group here, right? I feel like I belong while also not having to let go of anything that makes me, me. And this is rooted in the theory of optimal distinctiveness, which says that we strive for this optimal level of, I want to feel unique, but I also want to feel like I'm a part of something else. And so you start leaning too much one way or the other. Maybe you're starting to get rid of some of yourself to feel like I really want to, blend in and fit in. So I'm going to start ignoring parts of myself. Or you might start leaning towards too much the other way and feel like I'm an outcast and I don't really feel like I'm a part of this group. So there's an optimal level here that is this true feeling of inclusion where I am included. And you can think of this as, I have here a picture mosaic. So you may have seen some of these before, but overall you take a step back and you see one image, right? You see a pair of hands here. But if you zoom in really closely, you see that this is actually made up of so many different individual pictures, all unique in their own way. And so this, I just think that this is a beautiful representation of that true sense of uniqueness and belonging, that these unique people here and these unique identities and these unique pictures are coming together to form a cohesive group together. And so that's that underlying feeling of inclusion, what we're talking about today. And so often you hear inclusion talked about with diversity, D&I. They're just kind of lumped together, right? You hear D&I departments, you hear D&I roles opening up, and it's just, what's the difference between diversity and inclusion? So wanted to call out what is diversity? How does it relate to inclusion? We could think of diversity as a mix of perspectives, identities, and points of view. But that in and of itself doesn't mean that I feel like I am uniquely seen, but I also belong. So diversity and inclusion are not the same thing. However, when you bring in a sense of belonging, and that sense of I'm accepted, I have equal influence, and it's a process that's actively being achieved. It's not one and done and I just belong now. It's I continue to belong, I'm continue to be accepted, and I really do have a voice here that matters. And so when those two things come together, that's when you start getting at inclusion. And so, when I just cover the sense of uniqueness and belonging, we can think of uniqueness here, but it needs to be coupled with that sense of belonging to get to inclusion. Now, what in the world does this have to do with the workplace? Well, inclusion at work, we define it as a sense of belonging, connection, and community, just at the workplace. I mean, inclusion isn't a concept that I only care about when I'm at home. I feel it and I want it at work as well. And so the role of the organization is to help people feel welcomed, known, valued, and encouraged to bring that whole unique self to work. So that is what, in essence, inclusion is. Stopping there, I'd say historically, and even now a little bit, maybe not for this group because we're seeing trends towards learning about it and recognizing the importance of it. But stopping here, I think inclusion has been seen as a nice to have. Oh, that feels great. I'd love to feel that way. At work, awesome. But it's not just a fluffy, soft concept. It is important not only for us as human beings, but for the business overall. So we did some research to show what is the connection between feeling included and other outcomes that we tend to look at within the organizational space. And here's what we found. So we splitted groups up into those that felt included and those that didn't feel included. And these were full-time employees. And those that felt included at work had greater well-being, were more likely to represent their organization as a great place to work, were more engaged, intended to stay for longer. So they're just these slew of outcomes. And you see here that there is this concept of how connected do I feel to my organization? Do I feel like there's this equal access? Do I feel like I receive adequate information throughout my organization? And that's going to relate to me feeling included. So there are real processes and experiences that happen within organizations that relate to me feeling included. And at the end of the day, these are cold, hard numbers. I just think that there's a science to this, right? There is research behind inclusion and the importance of it. So with that being said, the next sort of stage in the conversation, I think the next question is, okay, great, how do I do it? How do I get there? So transitioning over to that, the next research study we did after that was looking at, okay, how do we, within the organization, what are the most important influencers of my level of inclusion? Is it feeling like I connect to my leadership? Oh, maybe it's my manager's job. You know, there are these questions swirling around, so we wanted to do a study to look into these drivers of inclusion. And what we found were that peers, so those that I work with on my own team, were the greatest contributing factor to my level of inclusion. Stopping there, that's just in and of itself a really fascinating finding, because we can think, well, it's the folks that I interact with the most. That could be a plausible explanation for that, right? As well, if I'm interacting with my peers the most, maybe I'm thinking of those interactions and those experiences when I'm thinking about my inclusion. However, leaders, managers, and peers on other teams were all significant predictors of my feelings of inclusion. So all of these different types of relationships within the organization are influencing how I feel there. If I feel accepted, if I feel like I belong. And so I think the takeaway here is that inclusion isn't just, something that you say, we're all for it, and maybe you put it on your website or you put it as a value. It is relational. It's something that we all play a role in, right? You look at this list, you fall in here somewhere, I'm sure, right? I know I'm a peer in some way, shape, or form. I am a peer. So we all play a role in moving the needle on inclusion. How do we do that? I'll pass it over to Venus now to talk a little bit more about how do we ourselves understand our role in moving the needle on a topic like inclusion.
Thank you, Ritu. We can't talk about inclusion without talking about power. Because most people think about inclusion as inviting others to the table. But at that table, they proceed to set the rules for who gets to eat first or last. Unfortunately, most people don't know that the way they manage their power influences others' feelings of inclusion. I know that to feel included, my ideas must influence decision-making processes, and I must be allowed to fully participate in our social systems. And those social systems are the organizations in which we work. One of the, if you could please pass it, read to the next slide. One of the things that we acquire as we enter the organization is power. And that power comes in various forms. One of them is personal power. Personal power comes from your strengths as an individual. It can come from the education level that you have. You have power if you have education. It can also come with expertise. And in organizations, in knowledge-based organizations, expertise gives you a lot of power. The other way that you can also acquire power is through relationships, because we're in social systems. That relationship, within relationships, there is information that we have. So sometimes we see that information is weaponized. I may have information that you don't have, and I don't necessarily share that with you, blocking you from completing your project. I also may have power when I have budget. Yes, I get to decide who has resources, who has the money to accomplish their goals, and who doesn't. When we have decision-making power is normally when we're a manager. And the other one is title and status. It doesn't always guarantee power, because I have known plenty of people with very high titles and no power to affect within organizations. But it's also important to see how those power dynamics influence the feelings of inclusion that people may feel within the organization, because exclusion happens normally at a one-on-one level when you're interacting with an individual. It doesn't happen when we make a big event. It happens when you have a meeting and you don't get invited, because the last time you were invited, you spoke up in this meeting. And suddenly somebody decided that what you have to say is not relevant, or we don't want to hear it because it rocks the status quo. The other aspect of power is within organizations. Research had shown that you can have divisions within the organization that had more power than others. So if I work for a technology organization, for instance, and I am a junior engineer, what I have to say may have more weight, more power that with their HR counterpart has, maybe the senior counterpart within the same organization. So within organizations, we have power dynamics. And with those, we talk about, in order for us to drive more inclusion, we want to have allies. And allyship comes with groups. Yes, numbers matters, because if I'm the only one who speaks up, yeah, maybe I may not have enough power to sway the decision making. But if I speak up in a group and more people come and say, yes, Venus, what you have to say matters, then I'm going to be able to influence the outcome of the organization, of the group. This is why tokenism is not something that we necessarily want. We don't want the only woman in that executive team. We don't want the only Black person in that executive team, because we know from research that this person will not be able to affect the outcomes of those teams when they are on their own. Their voice really gets muted. Let me see, if you could please go to the next one. So let's run a quick little poll. Think about, in a team of 5 people, 2 people typically take what percentage of speaking time? And we have 10%, we had 3%, 50%, 70%, and 90%.
All right, thanks so much, folks, for answering this poll question. I'll let it run another 5 seconds or so, and then I will share the results with Venus.
Thank you, Rhonda.
All right, that's great. Here you go, Venus.
Okay, we have 3% answered 10%. 14% of people said about 30%. 18% of people said 50%. Interesting, 50% of you said it was about 70%. And another 15% said 90%. And what is interesting is, yeah, actually half of the audience have the right answer, which is 70% of the time. If you could please go to the next slide, Ritu. Thank you. When we look at dynamics within a team, and I think as Ritu was talking about, it's the importance of the peer group. Yes, we talk about inclusion and it can feel really big concept, and like, how do I accomplish inclusion in my large organization when I'm only one out of 2,000 or 10,000? But the reality is that inclusion happens one-on-one, and it happens in small teams. This is where you can start. So if within your team, you currently have those dynamics with only 2 people out of 5 speak 70% of the time, those 2 people are exerting power within the organization and within the team. They're really influencing the outcomes of your team. So if you want to have a more fair division, you want to ensure that everybody gets to speak. And I can hear the cynic saying, but why would I expect, what I want to hear from that junior person? Like, I had more experience than them, and I don't, they don't know what they're talking about. And so, yes, those things could happen, but the reality is that that junior person may be able to see something that you cannot see. And what these employees now are expecting is that their voice is heard. And when we are allowing them, we give the space to hear their voice, I know that the outcomes will be way different than if we just operate in a homogeneous manner. If you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. And so in order for you to drive inclusion at the individual and group level, we have broken down the behaviors into 5 different categories. The first one is embracing diversity. And by that, it's accepting that we all have differences. Sometimes we focus so much in how we're all equal, we're all human, we all make mistakes. Yes, but we also are different. And there is something special about what you bring into the team and what this other person, even if it drives you crazy, there is something else this person can drive that you cannot bring into this team. And so when we talk about diversity, we don't just talk about bringing only women, bringing only people of color. We're also talking about bringing people with disabilities. We're talking about having really a complete team, white people, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, people with disabilities. There's a lot of people who have invisible disabilities that we don't even talk about, but we are maybe not allowing them to feel part of the team because we don't address those things within our teams. And so when you are at a table, think about who is at that table and who is missing and why. The moment that you put that lens to everything that you do, you're gonna see who is bluffing in terms of diversity and inclusion and who's not. Because to me, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, the executive teams should be reflecting the organization. And so it's very common to see people of color at low levels in organizations, and they call that inclusion and diversity. But to me, that's not representative of what we're talking about. We're talking about across the organization, we want to see that diversity. Second, because we're talking about power dynamics and the importance of really neutralizing those power dynamics to help people feel included, we need to think about how you as an individual share your access. Are you currently the gatekeeper of some information? Are you gatekeeper of some resources that others don't have access to? This is important because we know that as a minority, if you don't have access to those groups, if I don't have relationships with the VP, if I don't have relationships with people in power, I'm less likely to really progress in my career. I'm less likely to be effective in the things that I have to do. I have to work harder to get them done. So it's important that you think about what type of barriers are there in your organization, in your own team. What barriers are you being part of? So you can remove those barriers and ensure that you can support those within the organization to be effective. Yes, at the end of the day, we all want to be effective. Now, the third aspect is driving belonging. And I believe that belonging is really attached to motivational drivers. what enabled me to feel included is not what enabled you to feel included. We all have different levels of motivation, and our motivations are different. So I give you an example. I may feel included if you ask me in a meeting what I think. As an introvert, I may not want that at all. I may not feel included if you do that. I actually may feel threatened and stressed if you do that. So you want to ask the individual, have those conversations within your teams. Hey, what make you feel included? How do you know that you belong in this team? Having those conversations at the team level would enable you to really tap into individual needs and allow people to feel included. The fourth behavior you could adopt is recognition. It's really allowing people to be recognized for who they are, that differentiation that they bring into the team. And it's important that you pair that with asking that question, what make you feel recognized? Because as I was mentioning, maybe being called on a town hall meeting in front of 1,000 people is not what you really relish, it's not how you feel recognized. But maybe having an individual conversation is what you really need. So having that in the differentiation and understanding, and most importantly, recognizing people, it's what leads to feelings of inclusion. What I heard when I was working in HR for many years, what I heard from people who quit every single job was, I didn't feel recognized. And that was the bottom line of most people who left organizations. I didn't feel valued, I didn't feel recognized. And the fifth one, it's support. We know that not everybody has the playing field set. Some people have different barriers to achieve, and yes, we all have to navigate them. But if we can lend a hand and support others to be able to achieve their goals, this is what inclusion is about, is that we all allow access for success. And so when we do this, we can do this through mentorship. When we set up mentorship relationships that actually allow you to not just mentor people that look like you, that sound like you, because it's easier, but actually bring diversity into that mentorship relationship so you can learn from others that don't look like you. They may have a different set of ideas or experiences. The other one is actually sponsoring. We know that career progression really depends on sponsoring. So having someone who can sponsor you matters a lot. So if you have power, you can share that power by sponsoring others and looking for people who doesn't look like you to sponsor. Speaking up, I think, is opening the space. Sometimes when you have power, what you do is you speak up a lot. So in this case, what I would say is open the space for others to speak up within your team. And the last one is listening. It's very easy to exert power by always telling people what to do and how things need to run. But more importantly, it's listening, because when you get to listen, you get to open a space and you get to learn from others. And that you can pick one of these behaviors. You don't need to, you can try all, and that will be amazing and wonderful. But if you commit to just one of them, and within your teams and partner with someone to do those behaviors, I think that you can really start driving inclusion. Thank you. Let's go to Justin, who had some really amazing insights and research from his research at Great Heart.
Thank you, Venus. I appreciate that. And so, as we're wrapping up the kind of the session before we have a little bit of Q&A, is the idea that inclusion includes everybody. And so Venus just talked to us a little bit about some of the power and the hierarchy that we hold in work. The interesting thing is the power dynamics that exist. Each of us are born with different dynamics. That advantage exists all across the globe. It may look different in different cultural contexts. It may look different in the identity points that are valuable. Here in the US, I am a white male. I grew up middle class, and I went to college, and so I check a lot of the boxes of what the majority or what the expected systemic design was for the US. Interestingly enough, in that, I had no understanding of my power or the story that came behind that. So part of my journey as a white male is looking at what that means and what's both the systemic power that comes from that. So what are the things that are coming to me as a result that I can't control, but also my individual behaviors that I'm learning at too. And so as I think about that, it's so important as we look at including everybody. There's a lot of work that's been done for people that have not had that power in the past. And so there are people who have held that power starting to feel a little bit of tension. And that's okay, because they're in that process of learning and experience this at the same time. So as we're talking about this, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Ritu. So we did a study at Great Heart Consulting on white men leading through D&I. And so one of the things that I put white in parentheses, because I think that it applies really to people in advantage. We're talking about men in particular in this study, but as you think about your form of it, and we all have a spectrum, some have more advantage than others, but there's ways that we process in that. As a part of this study, we did in 2013, consulted with companies like Bank of America and Walmart to get a survey of 670 leaders on their D&I practices, both those who identified as white men and their peers who did not. The hypothesis of the survey was, when asked to rate their effectiveness, white men in general said they would lead through D&I more effective than what their diverse colleagues would say of them. So that their belief in themselves that they were leading in this way was much higher. And the survey findings that we'll dig into are white men did indeed rate themselves more positively than their diverse colleagues. But we did find that engaging this group is a vital part of success. As you look at the hierarchy and move up, Venus was talking about you can't just have lower level diverse candidates and say you have an inclusive environment. So what are the ways that you can engage both sides of this? So as you go up in an organization, you have a truly diverse organization where people are partnering and working together. If you don't mind moving to the next slide. This is just really some demographics for you. I know some people like to see data behind what it is, but primarily about 70% of the people asked were white men. As you see kind of the breakout of how they identified their race. At a leadership level, really there's a mix of organizational effectiveness. So we go across the organization looking at people that sit across different roles. And then finally, interesting, thinking about most organizations aren't just one country based anymore. They're very global organizations. And as you think about inclusion in leading a global team, it really changes what is important in one country, maybe not so much in another. So thinking about your leadership style. So it's a very global network as people thinking about their demographics. The next slide, Ritu. So really there, from the study, so once again, this was done looking with white men and talking about that, but really thinking about advantages that exist within all organizations and what are ways that we can do that. So there's 5 key points that we found, and I'm gonna hit some high levels of them, and I'll be happy to go back and talk through more later. But so the conversation about D&I with white male leaders requires care and focus. So there's really a safety concern on both sides. So you have from the white men who have never really been having to deal with this. As I said, most probably organizational benefited them, society benefited them. And so they're being introduced this idea that some things may be out of their control. So there may be some systemic power that exists that they've never had to think about or process in their own story. And so now that someone is pointing that out and making them deal with some of the internal stuff, as well as what it means for the company, there's a lot of concern in that. As well as the people who are diverse colleagues, wanting to make sure that they have safety in that conversation. Will the person hear me? Can I say this in a way and engage them that this is not going to isolate me and affect me in the long run? Another thing we found in that is the definitions are very important because there is a social narrative about what whiteness or maleness or a lot of different things are. So as what it means to me may be slightly different to someone else. And so if we peanut butter the approach and say all people are this, then you may get some bucking from that. The second point that we found in the study is when asked about 12 key components of they positively rate themselves 45% of the time on their effectiveness to lead in diverse, while their diverse colleagues only did 21%. So the white men rated themselves about 45% effective on different D&I measures, while their diverse colleagues only at 21%. So that's a perception gap that we're really needing to process as it comes to these conversations. How do you tell somebody that they may not be there right away? Relationship is really key in that point to be able to know who you're talking with and developing that relationship versus coming and just saying, we're not matching. Looking at that, the third point then, the effectiveness gap counts. And so that gap is really what we just talked about in the previous point, the idea of where I think I am versus where somebody else may think I am. And so that really helps us measure the percentage and the difference between those two responses. And so the larger the gap that exists, the more likely you are to cause rifts in future engagement from everyone in the company. So that if our intent and our impacts don't align to one another, you can see some really long-term impacts of not having this conversation and having honesty, and candor in that space to say, this is where we are and this is where we're going. To that point, thinking about candor, one of the biggest things that we found in our study for white male leaders is looking for that investment in respect and that commitment to candor. So 80% of all respondents offered a positive effectiveness rating on the ability of white male leaders to show respect for diverse coworkers. So most people that were studied say, yes, they can show respect, and that honoring and esteeming of a character and the contribution of others is one of the first steps towards helping the building blocks of building the larger work with white men in this instance. You know, and a commitment to candor, so thinking when it comes to saying just what needs to be said among your diverse coworkers, white male leaders in your company generally are only 35% effective or extremely effective. So about a third of the people said their white male colleagues were good at talking about diversity and inclusion measures. So it's really key also to have practice. You know, one of the things we'll talk about in a minute, and a model that we'll show is this place we call careful skill practice, where there's this awkwardness. And the D&I, and the title is inclusion confusion. You know, there's things that we try on and some work really well. And we try on other things and they fall flat. You know, so it's finding that committing to candor and the openness in the process. And the final thing that we just want to say as part of the study is conflict is a very real part of this. You know, any assumption that as we're putting people that think differently, process differently, that there won't be conflict, if you make that assumption at the very beginning, you're setting yourself up to have a more difficult time. If you have the candor and you go through the things we're talking about, you know, understanding that conflict is there, that it's a way to solve for, not as a roadblock to stop you. Do you mind moving to the next slide, Ritu? So this is just a few points that we wanted to share that what men, in particular historically advantaged people, and historically advantaged can be very different in different contexts. You know, in different countries it looks different. Here in the United States it looks different. But so everybody can do this, but this also applies particularly for those who have had some of the power that Venus spoke about, whether in work or systemically. So don't expect others to be your teacher. You know, as you approach your learning with humility and curiosity, find ways that you can engage in a topic that you don't know about or you want to know more. You know, thinking about what's your investment and how do I want to be seen by others. It can be very difficult as you're learning about parts that others may have always seen about you or your culture. You don't see yourselves, but don't react. You know, that initial response and the feedback, as you start asking for feedback from people and as they give you honesty back, don't react to what they tell you. Take time to really reflect on what they're sharing and see from their perspective and develop the empathy to say, oh, I can see where this is coming from. So take time to align on your intent and your impact of your actions, particularly with those who people are different from you. And so the intent earlier on, as you're on this journey, so we'll say a fair amount of white men, I'll put myself in this, we want our intent to be the thing that is judged. I didn't mean to do that. When I said that, it wasn't what I wanted. This is what I meant. But the impact is the very real effect that the person feels regardless of what the intent is. So thinking about that, what are ways that what I want to happen and what I want to say in your process and journey aligns with the impact that you want others to feel in a positive way. Find peers who can join you in your learning and sharing together. You know, the idea of peer learning for us is such a key part of this because it is that practice. It's the learning, it's the trying things on, and having a safe space of people to be able to say, you know, have you experienced anything like this? When I was talking in this meeting today, I interrupted somebody and somebody came back in and I did it really badly. And so it's this opportunity to find people to share that learning with you. You're keeping each other accountable and allows you to feel more confident as you move forward. Learning about your own identity is actually one of the most important things, I think, in this journey. You know, starting from the personal to say, what formed me? You know, what are the lenses or the ways that I view the world? As I think about my peer group, what about them? One of my favorites is there's a book called The Loudest Duck, and in it talks about two cultures different, primarily the United States and then in China, where in the United States, the saying is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So culturally, we're taught as a company or as a culture that if we're loud enough, if we make enough noise, somebody will see to me and I'll get my way. You look at Chinese culture, it's the loudest duck gets shot or the highest nail gets hit down first. You know, so culturally, you're talking about something where if you stick out, you are going to be hit down or you're going to be removed first. So sometimes even without understanding and knowing our own story, the ways that they interact with cultures across the globe. And finally, putting yourself in a position where you're not a part of the majority. So if you do find yourself more often not in the advantage categories, what are ways that you can feel separate, right? And part of the benefit of that is there's really helping you develop empathy and seeing from others' perspectives that may in their day-to-day life not have as much power as you do. And they have to navigate that every single day. What choices do they make in what they share? What parts of themselves can they bring as a part of belonging? And so for you to learn and start to experience and engage with other people, finding where you're not the majority where you're at. And the last thing that we'll look at today, so this is a model that we like to use at Great Heart, but it's the 5 stages of inclusive leadership or transformation. The first one is pre-awareness. So this is saying, why does this matter? The next one is interest and necessity. So it's starting to say, will you tell me more? I want to learn, what can I do? The careful practice is the third step. So this is that stage where you're really trying things on. So how can I do this? What does this look like? Activated is where you're starting to be more outward. You're starting to engage with other people. You're starting to be seen for what you're doing. And then finally, influencing is the far end. And this is where you're being seen and you're active with others. You're engaged in the community. And one of the things we love about this is it transitions more from personal. So the pre-awareness and interest and necessity tends to be more of the I side of the inclusion learning. As you move towards outwardly and activated and influencing is more, what can I do with this now? How can I help and engage other people in this process? And what we particularly like about this is this applies across all different aspects of our identity. There's certain places where, because of my life experience, I may be activated, maybe learning. I'm being a white male and I'm learning what that means in the space. I've been doing my work there. When it comes to something like ableism, and my ability to understand, the ability that I can walk to where I'm going and not have to think about, the requirements or the disability requirements may exist. I'm earlier on in that process. And it's funny, you can even hear it in how I'm talking. My language isn't as strong, and I feel a little bit of fluster as when I talk about places where I may be earlier on in those 5 stages. And so it's the acknowledgement that, we're all on a journey and that we're learning, and that's okay. The idea isn't there's rightness or wrongness here, but how do we nudge and practice ourselves to the next space? So with that is bringing us to kind of the key takeaways of our presentation. I want to thank both Ritu and Venus for sharing some of the data and science behind it. Thank you for your time coming today. So some of the key takeaways before we go to Q&A for you is this. Inclusion is a sense of uniqueness and belonging. For each of us, finding both how we belong, the uniqueness of ourselves, how we belong in our teams, in our society, or our cultures that we exist in. It is good for people, and it's good for business. That Ritu shared some of the benefits and the research behind engaged people. Engaged teams want to be at work. They want to come up with more creative and innovative solutions. Everyone plays a role in driving inclusion. So each of us have our own space to practice. We're both learning as an individual and how we bring those to the teams and the groups that we work with. In order to include others, we must understand our own power dynamics. That includes both our implicit power that we have and the ways that we present ourselves. And one of the things that I loved what Venus was talking about earlier is thinking about each of us want feedback in a different way, whether in a team meeting. So how do we understand what our power dynamics and roles are and ask individuals, and ask them again, because that may change over time. And finally, this is a journey. We appreciate your time here. I know about 70% of you said you're either learning or doing this right. You are on a journey and you've done your own processing. Some of the people you're hoping to engage with may not be there yet. And so our role is to not judge them for where they are now. Embarrassingly, if I think back to where I was 10 years ago compared to where I am now in this journey, I would never even have talked to me. So we're all on our own journey as we're growing this. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to hand it back to Rhonda, where we're going to have an opportunity for some Q&A with the 3 of us.
Yes, thanks, Justin, and thank you, Venus and Ritu. We have some great questions and comments coming in here, and we'll start with the first question here. How can we foster inclusion in an organization that rewards exclusion?
I think that, so let me take that. I think that it really starts with going back to the culture. I think that we talk about diversity and inclusion without talking about how to it's embedded within the culture of the organization. The behaviors, the way that people get socialized. Yeah, we talk about socialization in the way we grew up. We get socialized also when we come into this organization. We start seeing, oh, this is how things are done. Yeah, I exclude these other people. I only talk to so and so to get things done. And so I think that it starts with noticing those differences and really trying to be an ally by driving the opposite of that. Like, it will take a sense of courage. Honestly, this work requires courage for you to change the norm. And it's hard because we're talking about systems, but if you do have the opportunity, if you come in a position of leadership, talking about how you shift the practices of the organization in terms of policy, you know, what norms that the organization behave by, is very important to really drive this change. So this change will require individual engagement and systemic engagement, systemic from the part of policies. But don't think that only running policies will lead to adoption, because what we see in a lot of very old organizations is that those old habits remain strong. And so unless you drive this from the top with very clear values, what does it mean to be inclusive? What does it mean that we care about diversity? How does that translate to how we hire? How do we promote people? Those have to be evident, because what people do is people copy behavior. Under uncertainty, they just copy. Like, I noticed that so-and-so got promoted, you just start copying. Nobody that I know is really being conscious around these things, because their brain naturally, it's in an unconscious mode. And so you have to drive that consciousness, that intentionality with the behaviors, the ideas, the intentions that you have. How do I hire? You gotta demand that you're hiring, the candidate slate, is diverse. If you don't do that and say, I'm not going to review these candidates unless I have a diverse candidate slate, then you're basically succumbing to the culture of the organization and driving the same type of patterns. So you have to really be aware of the patterns so you can call them out. And if you have the power, drive new policies and new norms that can shift the organization so they can impact the individual.
Yeah, my mind went to the same exact word as culture here. And it's so important to realize that, you know, this is evident in behavior change literature. Like, we're going to look to our environment. We're going to look to what's expected here, what's valued here, what's rewarded here. The exact language that was used is what's rewarded. And so you have to recognize you're working against culture, which is so pervasive. And at the end of the day, the culture needs to change. Like, you need to be intentional about what are the symbols that we have around, what are the sort of things that we're communicating to our employees about what's valued. And even if you might think that, no, we want folks to be included, if you are able to say as an employee and your experience there that exclusion is rewarded, culture change needs to happen. And that involves so many different facets that it can start with education, and you can start asking questions and challenging what is the culture here versus what we want it to be, and how do we start making that change. So I agree with everything that you said, Venus. I think that culture is the thing that comes to mind, and that is so pervasive, and that needs to, I think, change within the organization.
I'm just gonna 2 seconds in. Rewards work. How are people being rewarded? You know, Venus was talking about it. They're watching, and so very key. And the other thing, if you have a position of authority, repetition is very important. You know, particularly with this, where it may be people feel it's a flavor of the week, or the idea that D&I, the message is changing so much in an organization. Having someone repeat the same thing over so they can see it and they can start to ingrain it into the culture is so vital.
Great, thanks so much, folks. Another question here from Caroline. If the inclusion happens in one-to-one interactions, what are the first steps to implement a diversity and inclusion strategy?
So let me just go take a little of a top here before I go with that. But one of the things that I think people have to do is a little bit of education around communication and conflict management, like Justin was mentioning. Because what happens is when we see the data in diverse teams, the diverse teams do have more conflict. And if we don't prepare the employees for the diversity that will come in, the change in dynamics, then we're going to set them a little bit to fail. And so I think that, believe it or not, I run these workshops. And one of the things that I've seen a lot is people, because of the nature of the work, tend to problem solve, tend to, like, every time an individual comes into their office, they don't do any active listening. Because we're all in this task orientation, efficiency, get things done. The last thing I want to do is have a conversation with you and sit here for 20 minutes. I just need to solve the problem. So understanding that you have to train people in how to actively listen, how to paraphrase, so you can really hear what people say. Because when I feel included, when I feel heard and seen, is when I get someone who uses those communication skills of paraphrasing, of active listening, involving the conversations. I feel like, oh, I actually felt heard. I came to my manager and he heard what I have to say, yes? And it doesn't mean that he necessarily agree with me, because it's not about agreement. It's about feeling heard. And so I will roll out trainings around communication skills and being able to help people understand how to have those candid conversations. That's one aspect at the individual level. At the organizational level, I think as Ritu and I were mentioning, you do want to try to drive like policies around inclusion and say, okay, how do we ensure that we are supporting our LGBTQ members? How are we supporting our members from the disabled community? How are we supporting our African American members? You have to have like things in place in terms of policies and ensure that you're really bringing them at the table, yes? Because if you're having, this is what happens sometimes. You have people from the minority communities who get asked a lot about, what do you think? What's your experience about this and that? But they're just used as a library, yes, for telling me what do you think. But what they say doesn't necessarily influence the outcomes. They get burned out, they get tired. So you have to show in the conversations and the things that you do that their ideas do matter, and that comes embedded within how do you drive the culture of the organization. How are the promotions getting done? Are people getting at the leadership level, are they getting rewarded for actually showing inclusion in their teams? You know, how inclusive are the teams? I think that to quantify it is hard, yes, because a lot of people say, well, that's a really kind of fuzzy feeling that we all get. Yes, it is, but it comes from specific behaviors. And so one of the ways that I think that you kind of zero down in, if you start driving it at the organizational level, is by looking at the levels of inclusion within your meetings. I advocate and I have run projects in which we look at inclusive meeting behavior and ask people to rate how inclusive those meetings were. That is matrix, that is data that you can use to see that you're actually making progress within the organization as you're driving these different practices.
Yeah, I think I would just echo everything you said, Venus, in terms of, you know, inclusion is relational and happens within human interactions, but that is, you know, that's not to say it's go figure it out, folks, go do it, because I know, you know, Justin mentioned that this is hard, this is awkward. I'm going to be looking around for, am I doing this right? What does it even mean to be inclusive? How can I go about doing that in my organization? So there's such a huge element of, you know, what are the policies, practices, what are the trainings available to educate, enable, and reinforce inclusive behaviors at your organization that's really ultimately driving the behavior that you do want to see at that relational level. The other thing that I would add is that there are, I think, just so many different things that that come to mind with inclusion that we're still figuring out. So I think another part of this is inclusion, and something like this, maybe sharing a training with your employees and figuring out like where are the gaps in knowledge needed. So a part of this is asking folks and thinking to yourself, do you use an inclusion survey? Is there a place or a forum or a means by which you're gauging the extent to which employees do feel included right now? How are you getting a pulse on that? And so I think instead of sort of blindly shooting in the dark and hoping that we're trying to make things different within our organization, it's let's start by figuring out where folks are right now and where we need to invest our efforts so that we can be strategic about it.
And the other thing I think about in this process is, inviting others as a part of the journey to learn with you. So if you're thinking at a team-based level, ask your team, I want to know more about this. I'm not the expert here. Can we do this together? And that fosters both that sense of belonging where the humility to say we're learning about this, and it breaks away some of those dynamics of power that exist.
Again, thanks so much, folks. I think we have time for one more here, and great comments coming in as well. The next question we have is, based on the first poll, most of the respondents felt they were learning or doing it right. How do I introduce those from advantage groups to join me on the journey?
So I think it's important to recognize and honor where someone is at to begin with, right? And in some of our work with people, it's meeting people where they're at. And that's such a key part to those that haven't had to think about their journey or the way that inclusion really includes them and in others. And so recommending you to come alongside with them. Finding allies within that community is helpful for you too. And so finding people that who are from advantage communities that are more with it. Maybe it's through your own personal experience, or your company has data saying these leaders are people that our employees are saying have more inclusive behaviors, and starting to engage with them and find ways that they can also work with their other peers in their advantage groups. And so it's not always someone from the outside trying to teach, but who are the allies within a community that can help teach others within that space too.
Yeah, that question reminds me of the finding from the study you mentioned, Justin, where there's that perception gap. What if we think that we're doing this amazing job, but the folks that we're interacting with don't necessarily feel that way? So how can we go about pursuing that and seeing what might be the alignment or misalignment between how I feel like I'm doing and how others perceive my behaviors?
Yeah, you just reminded me something, Reed, too. One, I think the most precious commodities we have in our work is time. And we're talking about how we can't have a conversation, we need to get things done. So thinking about investing in those relationships, I heard a story of a very senior person organization that would do one-on-ones with their skip levels 2 down. And they'd meet every month a significant amount of time with these people. And someone said, how do you have the time or willingness to do that? He said, the information and the feedback that I get in this process, because I'm having all these conversations, is I'm never surprised. They have so much more information at their fingertips that they're not spending that additional time trying to fight fires after the fact. So they're using inclusive behaviors to get feedback to help build that loop in to be able to be preemptive on how they solve some of their issues.
Awesome.
Okay, great. So we're getting close to the top of the hour here. So I wanted to take this time on behalf of myself and HR.com to thank Justin and Venus and Ritu and Limeade for an excellent presentation. And like I said, lots of great comments coming in. There are quite a few more questions there, and I'm sure that the folks at Limeade will follow up with them after the presentation today. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. If you'd like to view the webcast again, I will have it archived on hr.com by the end of day today, and we will send you an email as well from hr.com with your certification credit information. So again, this concludes the webcast. Thanks again, guys, so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.